Hello, my name's Oluwatimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today is January the 8th, 2026. It's been 5 days since US forces invaded Venezuela and literally kidnapped its president, incumbent president, Nicolas Maduro and his wife, uh, transporting him to New York to face where he's currently facing, uh, charges for alleged drug trafficking. Now, so today, what I want to do is talk about um, uh, how this is, you know, damaging the reputation of the United States, um, internationally, right? Apart from how upset American citizens are. Um, I want to do so by comparing an instance when Nigeria tried to do something similar. Nigeria didn't succeed because Nigeria didn't have the expertise and the sort of forces to execute it. So Nigeria attempted its kidnapping in a different way. So it also created an international uproar, and so it was a different kind of blowback that Nigeria suffered. But just to show you that, in spite of the success of the execution, a success of our military forces, just because we have the strongest military in the world by far, and we were able to execute it. Uh, in any event, it's still a violation of international law. And I've said I'm going to do subsequent videos explaining how it violated international law. Um, Before I discuss Nigeria, where I'm originally from, by the way, and of course I'm an American citizen, but I'm originally from Nigeria, and so before I discuss the instance when uh, the Nigerian government, tried to kidnap a Nigerian official, right, who'd embezzled money, about £6 billion allegedly. He was in England, and Nigerian government tried to kidnap him so that he could come and face charges in Nigeria because he was a fugitive from the law in Nigeria. So before I discuss it, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine. I've seen various interviews, including one by President Trump's deputy chief of staff, and espousing the Monroe Doctrine. So everybody's been talking about the Monroe Doctrine. So I just wanted to clarify the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a 19th century concept. In the 19th century, compared to post World War II, America was primitive. The world was still very imperialistic. The world was still very barbaric, right, compared to the 21st century, and especially post World War II, the ascendancy of the United States. In the 19th century, in 1823, America was not a world power. We were not yet a world power. And of course, what was also saving us was that there wasn't the revolution in technology and transportation. America hadn't yet gone through its revolution. Travel was still very primitive. Trying to get from the Atlantic to to a from across the Atlantic from Europe to America was a death voyage, right? It was like rolling dice. You could die, you could live, right? It was a it was a hazardous trip. So America had that protection, and so we could issue the Monroe Doctrine. So we were, and also, there was the issue of our insecurity, right? So let me explain what the Monroe Doctrine was first of all. So this was 1823. The Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams. Our president was James Monroe. So even though the doctrine bears the name of James Monroe, the president at the time, it wasn't his idea. He didn't invent the Monroe Doctrine. So people misunderstand that. The Monroe Doctrine was completely from the mind of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was subsequent president after James Monroe. right? John Quincy Adams was our sixth president, but at this time in 1823, he was the Secretary of State. Now, this was after Latin American countries had gotten their independence, from the European powers, France and Spain. Now, so the only other European power that had significant interests or colonies in the Americas was England. They still had Canada, right? I don't think Canada, they still had interest in Canada. And in fact, later on, America and England and Great Britain, like they jointly ran Oregon. They jointly shared, they jointly controlled the territory of Oregon at the time. And so it was actually the British Foreign Minister at the time, George Canning, right? He'd he'd suggested to the Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and tried to influence James Monroe that America and Great Britain should issue a joint statement, keeping that European powers should no longer attempt to recolonize in the Western Hemisphere Latin American countries. That was basically what it was. That the Western Hemisphere was not open to European powers for recolonization. That was supposed to be the joint statement, right? However, the U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams convinced, he sort of went behind the British Foreign Minister George Canning, who suggested it, and convinced the incumbent president James Monroe that America should make a unilateral statement, because if America went on and acceded to George Canning, that's the British Foreign Minister, if America acquiesced with his desire, his suggestion that it should be a joint statement on the non-interference and the closure of the Western Hemisphere, including the Latin American countries, to European recolonization. It would make, in the words of the genius John Quincy Adams, he said it would make the United States appear as a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. Let me repeat that. John Quincy Adams said that if America went ahead and made a joint statement, barring European powers from the Western Hemisphere and the Latin Americas, barring them from recolonization, that it would make the United States of America appear as a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. So basically, that was just a Victorian era, because those were Victorian times, a Victorian era or American way in the 19th century way of saying it would make America appear as a flunky of Britain. Now, Britain was the superior power at that time, right? America was not a power. Britain was the one that had the strongest naval force, right? But the thing is, Britain had just finished fighting wars. I mean, it was just about a decade, right? They had just finished fighting wars against Napoleon, right? Defeating Napoleon. They kept on, Britain was involved in a lot of wars, right? So Britain had other issues it was dealing with. It was colonizing Asia. It was going to soon start colonizing. It was trying to stop the slave trade on the Atlantic. Dealing with West Africa, trying to stop slavery in Africa, because they were shipping, kidnapping and shipping Africans, so it was dealing with a lot of things, right? But Britain was the undisputed naval power still. America was not as strong as England. America did not have the power to pull it off. It was really going to be America and England keeping France and Spain away from the Americas, right? But John Quincy Adams brilliantly persuaded James Monroe to issue a unilateral statement to assert America's independence from Great Britain so that we didn't appear as a flunky. In the words of John Quincy Adams, we didn't appear as a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. So that's an allusion to England's superior naval power. It was England that had the naval power to keep them away, right? We didn't have a strong navy at the time, right? So that's the Monroe Doctrine. That's the Monroe Doctrine, right? And people keep citing this thing. And since then, of course, we became expansionist in Latin America. And then there was what was called the Roosevelt corollary. The Roosevelt corollary that came during the time of President Teddy Roosevelt, who was a little bit extra, very dynamic, right? And of course, this was after the Spanish-American War of, was it 1898, when we basically, we occupied Cuba briefly. And Teddy Roosevelt himself went and led the Rough Riders, shooting off people. I read his autobiography, and he talks about how he actually, killed people and, and all that stuff at war, which was, a little bit left field. But in any event, Teddy Roosevelt then goes ahead and now he issues his own statement, his own doctrine called the Roosevelt Corollary, because America was helping, European powers had started to invest in the Caribbean nations, right? And many of them were owing money, like, Haiti, the Dominicans, there were lots of people, Latin American countries owing money. So basically, and some of them, there were times that the British, the European powers would now blockade these Caribbean nations because they were trying to collect debts. And of course, America didn't want them around. So what Roosevelt was saying was that, okay, you know what? Instead of them, if these countries in the Caribbeans and the Western Hemisphere are not managing themselves properly and just, they would act as the referees and they would interfere. America has a right to go in and interfere. America would go into the country occupied and run it properly so they could collect debts, loans on behalf of European powers, so European powers didn't come to interfere, in the Western Hemisphere. Because America was, again, it was not yet powerful, and America understood the European nations, how they loved war, right? Europeans were experts of war for three, millennia, right? 3,000 years from the time of the Romans, right? The conquest, the Greeks, Alexander the Great, they loved war. And then the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans, they've been fighting France, Napoleon, they've been fighting wars. They love conquest. And they knew if Europe came to the Americas, it would threaten America's interests. So those were America's concerns. And America started expanding, right? By the time of Roosevelt, Roosevelt actually did something he showed off, because we had now started to build our Navy. At some point, Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and so we expanded our Navy. And I think we now had a superior, one of the largest, naval battleships. So he had our Navy do a show of force and had the Navy do a tour around the world or something. He went to Japan just to, our fleet. It was a lot of money, but the idea was to just show that, hey, we have this naval might now, and so nobody should mess with us, right? So as a deterrent. And so the Monroe Doctrine was supposed to be originally as a deterrent, and also our military force, our military might. We have by far the largest military in the world, and I'm going to bring us back to where we are today, right? Since then, the rules-based international order has been led by the United States since the Second World War. In the aftermath of the Second World War, America created the United Nations. America, our 28th President Woodrow Wilson had been the architect of the League of Nations. The idea was that nations should work together, have rules, to prevent wars, because these wars were very costly. They cost a lot of lives, and of course, sovereign nations wanted to try and stop these wars. And America, the Senate, even though it was America that, that was the architect of the League of Nations in the end of the First World War, U.S. Congress refused to ratify our membership. So we never joined the League of Nations during Woodrow Wilson's era because, because Congress was concerned that if we joined, a membership would constrain Congress's ability to declare war, right? So Congress didn't want other nations to influence the United States' ability to declare war, right? That was very important for Congress. America was naturally isolationist, right? They didn't want to go into Europe. They didn't want to get involved in European wars. And that was one of the reasons America also got to expand and develop and grow. Well, we got involved in those two worlds in any event because, we were all constantly attacked. In the First World War, Germany kept, bombing American boats and American ships and killing Americans. That brought us in the First World War. And then the Second World War, of course, Japanese forces bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December of 1941, which forced America to get involved. So America now led another rules-based system, the United Nations, and this time America joined. America not only joined, but the headquarters of the United Nations is in New York, in America, right? We were able to get all the countries in the world, countries in the world, to join that, okay, we're going to work together and create international law, right? And adhere to international law, right? To respect the sovereignty of all nations, right? And the other organizations, the international organizations that were created and America led, for instance, the World Bank, right? These are different nations of the world working together. And America has an outsized influence in the World Bank. And guess where the headquarters of the World Bank is? It's in Washington, D.C., in America as well. And there's also the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. It's another international organization, right? Non-governmental organization. That's what they're called, NGOs, right? It's also based in Washington, D.C. So America became the leader in this international rules-based system, right? That was based on international law, that we're developing international law, respect equality of nations and sovereignty of nations, even though we're clearly the superpower, right? We're the superpower. We have an outsized, a military that's stronger than anywhere in the world because we projected an image that we were going to be responsible with our power, right? So you see, we changed, it used to be called Department of War. After the Second World War, President Truman changed it to Department of Defense. So the idea was that our military was not to go and be aggressive and be waging aggressive wars and, be on the offensive, going to seek and conquer nations like they were doing in the 19th century, like Germany wanted to do, right? What set off the Second World War was Germany just aggressively wanted to seize nations with resources and things like that. Japan, that's what these nations wanted to do. This was what happened in the 19th century, right? Realpolitik, right? They just, hey, they have the power, they have the military, they want those resources. They go and pick it up like highway robbers, right? So America was projecting this image that that even though we have the strongest military in the world, we have atomic nuclear weapons, we're not going to abuse that power, right? We only keep this military for self-defense to deter a bad actor, a nation from trying to attack us. It's supposed to deter war. That's what America was saying, even though we have the strongest military in the world, and we continue to build that strong military. Okay, it's only for our defense, our self-defense. And nations believed us, and nations respected us for it, right? Nations respected us for it. So, so I'm gonna do a quick analogy, right? So even it's I'm going to compare the U.S. military with cash. It's just like a person, an individual who has money, right? If you don't have money in America, right, because we're an advanced capitalist nation, we have an alternative to money, reputation. Your reputation is indicated by your credit score. So if you don't have cash in America, you don't have the money. If you have a credit score of 800, right, banks are going to lend you money, right? If you don't have 50,000, they will lend you 50,000 just because you have a credit score of 800. Because they're like, yo, we'll lend you 200,000, half a million, 200, 2 million, because they say, well, you have a good reputation. You're going to pay us back. You have the ability to get an excellent job. You have ability to start a business and grow your business. You have a good reputation. You're not going to run away with our money, right? So you have a good reputation, even though you don't have cash, right? So what America did in the rules-based system that it created, that it led, that it championed, was that we had this currency, right? We had a very good reputation, right? So in when we go and act like gangsters, though, when we go and seize a nation's resources and kidnap them out of their president outright in violation of international law, by the way, that reputation, that currency we had, right? It becomes we damage it because there are other nations that have nuclear arms, but they don't have the sort of reputation America has in the rules-based international order, like Russia, China, right? But China has been laundering its reputation very strategically, right? They've been very successful in finessing other nations, less developed nations that have vast resources, like Nigeria, like in Africa, right? In Latin America. And this was what America was sort of uh, working against because it was desperate in seeing that China was doing vast amounts of trade, the most trade with Venezuela, which has the largest reserves of oil in the world, right? So now that if we go and use our weapons, the military might that no other nation in the world has, and we conduct ourselves like highway robbers, that reputation, that currency we had, it becomes damaged, right? And when your credit score is damaged, even though you have money, if your credit score is damaged, there's hardly anything you can do. You can't get a good job. You can't, it damages a lot of things. It damages a lot of opportunities. So that's similarly what's happening with America when we uh, conduct ourselves like, well, highway robbers. We can just use our military and kidnap other nations. Say, well, it's realpolitik. We have the guns, we have the force, we have the power, just like Stephen Miller suggested. In fact, he didn't suggest it; he said it outright, right, brazenly. It takes us back to medieval Europe, medieval times, when that was what kings did with their military. They just seized nations, because they have the military might to do that. So it takes us back to primitive times, barbaric times, right? And it especially in modern times where America is viewed as a leader. We marketed ourselves very well to the rest of the world, regardless of what was going on in America. I lived in Nigeria viewing America. So I only saw what America projected. And America knew how to launder its image to the rest of the world when I was growing up in Nigeria, for instance. So we weren't aware of the discrimination, the abuses that marginalized people feel, right? It took me to live here as an American citizen and see police brutality because I suffered police brutality on May 16, 2023. I haven't had justice. It took me living in America to see that there's corruption in the criminal justice system against people who are black. But living in Nigeria, right, growing up in Nigeria, what we saw was what the American government marketed to the world. And the media, the corporate media, helps America because they don't project the negative. They only show how minorities like Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan have integrated and they're successful. They don't show us the ghetto. They don't show us police brutality. At least when I was growing up in Nigeria, they just showed us, Bobby, that these were black people who were successful, doing well, right? They didn't show how they were discriminated. They didn't show how they called them nigger. They didn't show how police raided them, robbed them in their homes. I was robbed, raided by police in my homes with impunity. And there's a racist white judge who's violating my rights, even though I'm a law abiding immigrant. I've been defamed by a state attorney, a racist state attorney in Montgomery County, John McCarthy, who filed false charges against me. They've tried to coerce me to get into a plea bargain after I suffered police brutality in my home unprovoked. I was a law abiding citizen. They just did something crooked, right? Just similarly to what America is trying to do to Venezuela. We're trying to coerce them, right? Coerce them, take their oil to do business with us. That's not, so it changes the image of America as having a good reputation that the world, the smaller nations could respect and look up to, even though, they expected, smaller sovereign nations expected that America, even though they were stronger and mightier, that they would treat them with equality and respect, right? That was what America did post the Second World War, right? But this government, this administration is saying something differently now, right? And so now what I want to do is, since I've clarified the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary, right? The Roosevelt corollary, as I was trying to say, was it was basically saying that America would intervene, could go and occupy one of the countries in the Caribbean, right? Just to keep European powers out, right? If they were owed money or things like that. And if they were being mismanaged. And you see, there was a time Woodrow Wilson sent in the Marines, right? It was in 1913 or so, to go and seize $500,000 worth of gold from Haiti's bank, Haiti's national bank, removed it and deposited it in the National City Bank, which is in New York, which is the predecessor of Citibank, right? That was that was just outright gangster, and this is what our country is doing again, right? Our government is doing again under President Trump. These are outright gangster practices, and they're not admirable in the world. Other governments would look with fear, with trepidation, like Greenland, Denmark. You can see the statements being issued by Denmark and what have you. So now I'm going to talk about a time that Nigeria did something similar. So I'm originally from Nigeria. I spent most of my life living under military dictatorships. But there was a brief interregnum, right, for about just about 30 months when civilians were in power. Now, however, the civilians embezzled so much money, and that was a problem. The civilian government, democratically elected government, they rigged elections and they embezzled so much money. And there was this guy who was a minister of, was he Ministry of Finance? It was one of the ministers. I can't remember which portfolio he had, but he was a minister in the federal government in Nigeria. It was a civilian, and he was alleged to have stolen £6 billion. So Nigeria is one of the big oil companies. Remember, on December the 25th, President Trump actually bombed, Sokoto, the north of northern Nigeria, with respect to the activities of ISIS, Islamic terrorists, terrorists who've been ostensibly killing Christians. That's a claim. In any event, Nigeria also has. Nigeria is a nation, by the way, which also has vast oil reserves. Apart from that, it has other minerals, natural resources that it's never explored. It's got, gold. It's got steel, right? All these are unexplored. It's got vast reserves of columbite, cobalt. When you think about, engines, the things that go into engines to make engines, and chips for computers, things that make, computer chips and everything. So Nigeria has those those things. Nigeria also has northern Nigeria, other parts have uranium. So you can see America looking, the Trump government seems to be looking at nations that seem to have resources, right? But in any event, um, taking us back to the 1980s. So between 1980 and 1983, Nigerian government had a very corrupt civilian administration. So um, a coup was executed at the end of 1983. A guy called General Muhammadu Buhari would execute a coup. He'd leave the coup and become the head of state of Nigeria. Now, Nigerians were ecstatic, so this was a military dictatorship. The military took over power from the civilians, right? A democratically elected civilian government. But the thing is, they made accusations of corruption, embezzlement, and rigged elections. So even though, like, America violated the sovereignty of Venezuela, right, on January 3rd, 2026, some American officials, government officials, have been saying, well, let's see, the Venezuelans are very happy that they've been celebrating that President Maduro was kidnapped by the American military and transported to America to face charges, right? So the fact that this is going on, for the most part, many governments, right, many civilians in governments that are not going well, you see them, especially in third world countries, developing nations, you see them being ecstatic, right, when when the economy is not going well. Similarly, I mean, when our civilian government was overthrown, Nigerians were ecstatic in 1983, right, when the military came in. By the way, it was that's because I did military history in Nigeria and the history of also, Nigerian governments when I was in Nigeria. One of the professor who taught me the Nigerian military history and taught me about the coups in Nigeria was a professor who taught at the Nigerian Institute of Strategic Studies, right? I think that's what it was called. And that's where, many Nigerian generals, presidents, future presidents, they go to school there. So I was very fortunate to have been taught by this professor. He's late now, Professor Ibrahim James. And at the time, he did say it that coup led by Buhari was endorsed by the CIA. Now, Buhari had actually schooled in America at one time. He'd gone to school, I think, and at the postgraduate naval, one of the military academies we've had. So he went to school. He did a graduate studies in America, right? I think for undergrad, he went to military school at Sandhurst as well. But he did go to get a master's degree from one of America's military schools. I think it was at Pennsylvania, or maybe Naval Postgraduate Studies, one of those schools in any event. So it makes sense. So I was taught then that the CIA was the one who actually sponsored, endorsed that coup, right, for the military to topple a civilian government in end of 1983. So, so something else I wanted to quickly clarify a point, regarding people saying how Venezuelans are celebrating in the streets because their president, a civilian president, whom they regarded as corrupt, was kidnapped by a foreign government, violating their country's laws, kidnapped and brought to America, and they were celebrating it. Um, I was saying that this happens in third world countries, like it happened in Nigeria when the CIA sponsored a coup in Nigeria to overthrow a civilian, government that was embezzling funds, right? Nigerians were celebrating; they were ecstatic. Similarly, right? Even though this was not good for democracy, right? A military dictatorship is definitely not good for democracy. It's contrary to advancing democratic principles, right? Which the United States was supposed to be doing, right? Promoting democratically elected governments, protecting democratically elected governments around the world, right? Um, but however, let me take us back to the uh, the 19th century, just after we had gotten our independence. America ostensibly went to uh, war against Great Britain, like threw off the yoke of England because of taxes, right? Because of oppressive taxes. Now, after we got our independence, remember, because America was in debt, and to pay off our debt, the war debts, excuse me, the government decided uh, to impose taxes, which which triggered the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. There was also another time after uh, George Washington's administration, when he came into power after we had the new Constitution, uh, and Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, imposed taxes on distilled spirits, including whiskey, right? And it triggered the uh, the whiskey rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. What did George Washington do in response? He actually led militias of 13,000 troops to go and put down the rebellion. So it's the only time a sitting president ever led troops himself to go and put down an insurrection, a rebellion. So that was Western Pennsylvania, right? The farmers wanted to fight the government over taxes. Now, imagine if things had been different and England had now come to war against America during these rebellions when the government was trying to impose taxes on them. Do you think that England would not have won that war? England would have recolonized America, because those farmers who had fought on the side of uh, Washington would have turned against the United States, because the argument that America was fighting a war against oppressive taxes, right? No taxation without representation. That was our sloganeering during the war. It would be defeated. It would be false. It would be hypocritical, right? Because here was our newly independent nation now imposing taxes on the poor, on the farmers. And these poor farmers, thought that the government was in cozy relationships with the rich, and they were imposing taxes on the poor farmers just to oppress them, right? If Britain had come and said, "Well, uh, they're going to free the farmers from the oppressive central national government of George Washington," do you think that the farmers, the American citizens, would not have been ecstatic? They would have been ecstatic, right? They would have been ecstatic as well. They would have acted like the Venezuelans. They would have said, "Well, Britain was freeing them from an oppressive national government." Because remember, um, Hamilton and Madison argued for a stronger national government, central government, and for standing army, right? And so they would have thought, well, they just exchange one oppressor for another oppressor. So, hey, they would have been ecstatic that, hey, come and deal with these people who deceived us, right? So the fact that what I'm trying to say is that the fact that Venezuelans are ecstatic today because America did violated international law to kidnap their president, right? Because of their bad economy, it doesn't make it justified, right? It doesn't justify the bad action, the illegal action, right? It breaks international law. It breaks the sovereignty of Venezuela and Venezuelan laws as well. It doesn't justify, because at some point in our history, in the 19th century, in the late 18th century, at the beginning of our nation, there would have been Americans who would have been ecstatic as well, who would have supported a foreign government that was more powerful, who could come and free them from the oppression of the national government and George Washington's forces, who were imposing oppressive taxes on them at that time, right? All the tariffs. Remember when the South Carolinas, right, wanted to secede, the nullifiers, because John Quincy Adams was imposing what was called the tariff of abomination, which it wasn't John, it was Andrew Jackson who ended up collecting the tariffs, right? He imposed it anyway because Andrew Jackson was a very strong-willed president. He'd been a former general. He threatened. So he had the force of the government, federal government. He knew how to use the military, and he told the nullifiers that he was going to hang them if they did not abide by the laws of the federal government. So we've got to be very careful how we misrepresent events in a foreign nation and the people of a sovereign state. So now let me talk about what happened in Nigeria in 1984. So on July the 5th, 1984, the Nigerian government, had sent some operatives, some military officers, and used the assistance of Israelis, the Mossad, right? So that's another thing that the Mossad does, right? They've trained the intelligence of developing nations that can afford it. Nigeria had oil, right? Nigeria has oil, so the Mossad has trained many of our intelligence, not our. I'm an American citizen, but many of Nigeria's intelligence operatives, right? So in this instance, Umaru Dikko, that was his name, he was the former minister of Nigeria, alleged to have embezzled £6 billion, and he fled and was living in exile in the United Kingdom. So he was ambushed, he was drugged, and he was put in a crate, and he was on his way to be transported to Nigeria. So he was unconscious. He had an anesthesiologist with him because they had used put a tube in his throat so he wouldn't die. He would be able to continue breathing. And so, he'd been kidnapped by Nigerian government officials and, with the help of Israeli agents, the Mossad. However, there was a whistleblower. His secretary drew the attention of British officials, reported to British customs, a British customs officer who was suspicious of the crates that they were transporting. And so they raided them, they discovered the drugged, unconscious Umaru Dikko minister. So the Nigerian officials were arrested, 4 of them, and the Israelis as well, and they were tried and convicted in England. Nigerian diplomats were kicked out of England, and there was an impasse, and there were strained diplomatic relations between Nigeria and England, and there was an international outcry because here were Nigerians with the help of Israeli agents, Mossad. They were going to kidnap somebody living in England, without asking, using extradition laws and everything, because this man had embezzled £6 billion, right? And that's the other thing, right? Western nations have often housed and sheltered, rogue government officials from developing nations that have embezzled fortune, right? They've embezzled a fortune, depleted the coffers of these developing nations, right? Because they they bank the funds in these foreign governments, and it creates companies, they use it for investments to develop their own nations, right? This man took £6 billion, and the British government protected him in England, right? So, but in any event, so similar thing, right? America, because the man was charged, that's Umaru Dikko, he was charged in Nigeria. He was considered a fugitive from the law because he'd embezzled £6 billion from Nigeria. When he was minister, he stole that money. But England was protecting him, and they weren't going to give him up. So Nigeria, with the help of the Mossad, they tried to kidnap him and transport him back to Nigeria. They drugged him, put him in a crate, but it was foiled by the British government. They stopped it, right? And there was an international outcry. Nigeria now had pariah status, right? So if Nigeria could have pariah status for breaking international law, does America not expect to have pariah status just because it did execute the act, right, by going to kidnap In fact, in this case, it was an incumbent president in their own country, just so they could come and face apparent charges in the United States, alleged charges, right? The United States. Well, they're treaties, they're extradition treaties, they're things that you could go on. Of course, it would be very difficult to extradite Maduro from Venezuela because Maduro is the one who would have to sign off and approve the extradition, and he's not going to agree to do that. But in any event, that's just the way things are. There's some things you can get, and some things you're not able to accomplish, and you let sleeping dogs lie, right? In any event, that was what I wanted to just discuss today. I discussed the Monroe Doctrine. I clarified that, and as I said, there have been other doctrines that have surpassed it. Later on in the 1930s and the early part of the 20th century, America basically disavowed the Monroe Doctrine with a good neighbor policy, right? That, because the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt corollary, those were paternalistic, imperialistic doctrines and principles, right? They didn't respect the sovereignty of the Latin American countries, right? It was like looking at America as the big brother that knows better than the small states, right? Just right. The reason why John Quincy Adams insisted on the unilateral statement by James Monroe regarding the Monroe Doctrine was so that America was able to assert its independence and didn't look like, well, England was our big brother, or we were an appendage or vassal, or a subaltern or a lackey of Great Britain. So doctrines like the Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt corollary with respect to the Latin American states that America is supposed to be a shadow over, right, or protecting, right? It impugns their sovereignty. It makes America very paternalistic in relationship to these Latin American states, right? And it makes them appear as an appendage of the United States. So later on, we had the good neighbor policy, and since then, in 1948, following the Second World War, we actually developed. We formed organizations together, including the Organization of American States. We've had many other treaties, right? Sort of acknowledging the sovereignty of Latin American states, right? And again, we have the United Nations Charter and the other treaties, right, in which we respect the sovereignty of other states, of the Latin American states and other states that are even small powers, right? And where we treat them with equality, that we're saying everybody is a sovereign and equal state, just as we say in America that everyone is created, like all men were created equal, right? Our creed, which led us to war in the first place, when we declared independence from Great Britain, where they had the aristocracy, right, the nobility, a classification of people in society that, of course, that the nobility, the royal family, were superior to the peasants or the middle class, the lower classes, the commoners. And America was saying, no, that this doesn't apply to us. And that was the reason why, for instance, we prohibited use of noble titles in our Constitution. In America, we actually put it down that the noble titles, nobility, aristocracy, it's banned, it's prohibited in America. Even though we know in practice that's not the reality, right? The people who have, billionaire class, they seem to be doing things with their money, and it's violating the rights of the average American, the ordinary American today. In any event, let me stop here. It's getting to 50 minutes. And so my name is Umaru Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court, violating my Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws, and Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial and a fair trial, by Montgomery County, Maryland, and a corrupt judge, Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County, who in all likelihood has received a bribe to violate my constitutional rights and commit fraud on the courts. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.